Okay, we're going to get started, so make yourselves at home. Hi, I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and welcome to IAS Thursday. I want to open this event by remembering that the land we're on is the homeland of the Dakota people. The IAS recognizes that most of us are newcomers, relatively speaking, to this land, and that we honor and respect this place as part of our respect for the Ojibwe and Dakota nations of Minnesota. For those of you who are new to the IAS, we have a sign-up sheet outside, and if you'd like to be on our regular mailing list, please put your name on that list and your email, which is on the east side in the lobby. And also, the bookstore has brought some books by our speaker today, Roger Launius, and they're also on the lobby in that side. Next week, the IAS Thursday presentation will be downstairs, and it's Katerina Clark talking about A World Republic of Letters, overlooked by Pascal Casanova, the literary internationale between the wars. I'd like to introduce Matt Bribitzer-Stull, who's the director of the University Honors Program, who will talk about the context for today's talk and some other upcoming events.
So this is the fourth of 6 events on the Northrop lecture series. 3 occurred last semester. All 6 events are co-presented by the Institute for Advanced Study, the University Honors Program, and Northrop. I'll mention the 2 upcoming events momentarily. Honor students who are participating in the Nexus experience around the lecture series, we will retire to our usual haunt in Royalty Lounge at 6:30 this evening. Keep in mind that Susanna Smith and I are coming with 4 students from dinner, so if we're a tad late, go ahead and get started without us. Students who are going to dinner, if you haven't spoken to me, or if you have and you need a ride, just meet me right here where I'm sitting at the end of the Q&A, and we'll get you a ride to dinner. And then, without further ado, upcoming events. So, at Northrop, Saturday, March 2nd at 7:30 p.m., Sunday, March 3rd at 2 p.m., the Joffrey Ballet is performing Anna Karenina with live orchestra. There are many discounts available on tickets, including $10 student tickets, $15 student educator tickets for someone from any school, and $20 faculty rush tickets. Sunday, March 31st, 7:30 p.m., Inspired, a conversation with Misty Copeland. This is a benefit for Northrop youth programs. There'll be a conversation with Misty Copeland, who's a dancer, author, celebrity spokesperson, and the first African-American woman to serve as principal dancer in New York's American Ballet. Our 5th lecture is this place, this time, Thursday at 3:30, April 11th. Professor Rickerby Hines will be coming from UC Riverside to talk about his 2-person work that explores the complex relationship between communities of color and the police. That is free and open to all audiences. Then, 2 more. Tuesday, April 16th, downstairs in the main Carlson family stage, we have the free Guy Stanton Ford Memorial Lecture. This year's speaker is Nancy Eisenberg. She'll be speaking on the problem of democracy, past and present. And finally, the last on the Northrop Lecture Series, our keynote speaker, Carol Anderson, author of the best-selling book, White Rage, will be speaking at 7 p.m. on the main stage, Carlson Family Stage, Thursday, April 18th. So again, students participating, that date's a little bit later, or that time's a little bit later. I'll talk to you about arrangements for that day in an upcoming meeting. And then, without further ado, I'm going to send it back to Jennifer to introduce today's speaker.
Okay, as Matt said, this 1968 series is a co-presented by Northrop, IAS, and the University Honors Program. But today's talk is also co-sponsored by the Minnesota Space Grant Consortium, the Minnesota Institute for Astrophysics, the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communications, and the Departments of History, Philosophy, Anthropology, and Aerospace Engineering and Mechanics. And so thank you very much to all of our co-sponsors. You forgot? Oh, okay. If you have a chance, on your way out, go through the orange gallery exhibit. This is an exhibit also part of the 1968 series on the takeover of Morrill Hall back 50 years ago. And also downstairs on the third floor in the University Honors Program windows, there is also related exhibits. It's all 1968 all year. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Roger Launius. Roger grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, and graduated from Graceland College in Lamani, Iowa, and I probably just massacred the pronunciation of that town, before receiving his PhD in history from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. He was chief historian at NASA between 1990 and 2002, and he also served as associate director for collections and curatorial affairs, as well as senior curator and division chair in space history at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. I happen to know this is also a role in which he mentored and guided a number of University of Minnesota graduate students. Dr. Launius has written or edited more than 30 books on the history of space exploration, including the richly illustrated Smithsonian Atlas of Space Exploration, Imagining Space, Achievements, Possibilities, Projections, 1950 to 2050, and Coming Home, Reentry and Recovery from Space. He's also published extensively and to great acclaim on the history of the Latter-day Saints Church and on baseball, among many other subjects. A fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the International Academy of Astronautics, and the American Astronautical Society, an associate fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He is a frequent commentator in the media on space issues and is also active on Twitter. Without further ado, Roger Launius.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Roger Launius, even though I have a hard time recognizing all of those accolades. How many of you have been to my museum, which I like to refer to as my museum, on the Mall in Washington, D.C., the National Air and Space Museum? Most of you, or at least maybe half of you.
Most visited museum in the world.
And we never get tired of telling that to everybody. It is the most visited museum in the world, with approaching 9 million visitors a year. And that is a great acclaim. For those of you who have been there, you know how wonderful it is. For those of you who have not, I would urge you, at whatever point you find yourself in Washington, D.C., spend some time in that particular museum. When I was there, I had a little routine in the morning. I always came in early. And it was, let's see, can I make this go? There we go. And I would come in early in the morning. I would genuflect before the Apollo 11 spacecraft. I would go over and bow to the lunar lander. I'd walk by and wave to the Spirit of St. Louis. But after all, it's an airplane. I walk past that most of the time. Then I'd go to my office and start the day. It's a pretty good way to start the day. And it was fun. What I want to talk to you about today is to take you back more than 50 years, closer to 60 years now, for the origins of the space age and the race to get to the moon in the 1960s. Some of you, I can see from that you're a little bit older, and you may actually remember those moon landings in the late 1960s and early 1970s. For those of you who are not old enough to remember, hopefully I will recount this in a way that will provide you with some background. But the first thing I need to do is to talk to you about the reasons for flying in space. There are 5 rationales I can find, only 5. And everything sort of fits into that number. So the first reason, oh, by the way, the picture that you see on the left there is by Chesley Bonestell, who's a very famous space illustrator who lived in the 1940s to 1960s when he was most active. And this is his version of landing on the moon from 1949. Why a rocket would have wings in an airless void is beyond me, but nonetheless, there it is, looking surprisingly like a German V-2 rocket with some wings on it. But there are only 5 reasons to fly in space. The first one is scientific and discovery and understanding, and that's what NASA is mostly all about. What can we learn about the cosmos by going there, by undertaking remote sensing activities to learn more about other planets, or for that matter, this planet? And that's a big chunk. Nobody questions that. And the activities that we engage in with Mars rovers, or rovers that the Chinese have just landed on the backside of the moon not very long ago, or wherever else we might go. This has been a fundamentally important thing that we've engaged in throughout the space age. Nobody really questions it. The second reason is national security. We fly in space all the time for military purposes. Everything that you can imagine probably is taking place in space in a national security environment. Reconnaissance satellites, communication satellites, the global positioning system, which everybody uses all the time, and I dare say that probably some of you, if not most of you, have actually accessed that today to figure out where you are and where you need to go, is a military program and funded by the Department of Defense. So that's a second reason to fly in space. A third reason is economic competitiveness, and in other words, can you make a buck? And if you can, we'll figure out a way to fly in space to do that. There are lots of things that we do in space that are economically useful. One of those, one again that we couldn't live without today and would not want to live without, is global instantaneous telecommunications. Our ability to communicate anywhere in the world at any time, to tap resources around the globe through these communication satellites is pretty fundamental, and we're paying for that on a regular basis. Again, it's a very important part of what we do. There's lots of other things beyond that. There obviously is global positioning and the activities associated with buying and selling implements for making that possible. But there's also remote sensing of a variety that enables us to do things in ways with more efficiency than we've ever been able to do in the past. That's 3 reasons. None of those require humans to be in space. That's the most important point about that. Everybody in the world does these things. Most of them don't fly humans, but there are 2 reasons that require humans. The first one is human destiny and survival of the species. They're 2 sides of the same coin. The first one, human destiny, NASA loves to talk about all the time. It is human destiny to get off this planet, to explore new worlds, to go to other places, to ultimately become a multiplanetary species. And that's very ethereal, and people like it, and it's fun. At some level, Apollo, landing on the moon in the 1960s and early 70s, satisfied some of those requirements. Survival of the species is the flip side of the same thing. If we don't get off this planet, we're going to die here. We're going to become extinct here. And that is an absolute, guaranteed, stone-cold certainty. It's just a question of when. Several billion years in the future, the sun will become a red giant. It will engulf the entire solar system, and if we're not planet hopping somewhere else, we'll be gone too, along with everything else on this planet. Now, there is not a single member of Congress, and I've talked to lots of them over the years, who are excited about a threat that is several billion years in the future. Just saying. It's just, they don't get, you can't even get them excited about real threats that are more immediate. We could, of course, so foul the planet that we will not be able to survive here. We could nuke ourselves into oblivion. By the way, in either of those cases, we deserve to be extinct. But that's the 4th reason, and it requires humans because it's about getting off this planet as individuals, a species, and going somewhere else. And then there's a last reason. It's national prestige. You can call it what you want to. It's geopolitics. It has to do with sort of the stature of the nation in relationship to other nations of the world. And that's why the United States began to fly humans in the 1960s with the Mercury program, launched first in 1961, through the Gemini program of the mid-1960s, through Apollo to go to the moon in the latter 1960s, and oh, by the way, the space shuttle program that followed on. These were about national prestige. And at a fundamental level, it was about national prestige vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. For those of you who remember the Cold War, some of you in this audience do, many of you do not. you know how serious it was. We were convinced that they could obliterate us at any time they chose. And by the way, they were convinced of the same thing. We could do it to them. All it took was ballistic missile launches, and believe me, we came close on more than one occasion. Closer than anybody here wants to really know the details of. And that drove a lot of activities about demonstrating to the world our capability. And spaceflight, especially human spaceflight and impressive space activities, was about not just convincing the Soviet Union that we had enormous capabilities and they need to be careful about us, but also persuading those non-aligned nations who were not a part of the American NATO bloc fighting the Soviet Union, that we were the stronger of the two groups. You had in the 1960s, you had it before this time, but it really became significant at the point that nuclear weapons were real. You had the possibility of fighting to the death for every human on this planet, ultimately. And these two diametrically opposed and at odds economic and political systems, one was going to win, one was going to lose. There was no walking back from this. Over and over and over again, there were attempts to try to do so, but on both sides, hardliners stepped up. And when I was a kid in elementary school in the mid-1960s, we did duck and cover exercises. Any of you who are a little older remember that? Where you crawled under your desk like that would protect you from a nuclear blast. I thought it was stupid when I was 10. And it was. Now, students have to do horrible things today, like active shooter drills and things of that nature. But nuclear weapons has not been something that has made most people afraid for at least a generation. It may be the case in the future, but not at this point in time. National prestige and the American efforts in space was about impressing the rest of the world. What's the most sophisticated technology you can think of? Spaceflight. And that would impress everybody else that we had capabilities that nobody else was aware of. So those are the 5 reasons. There are really only 5. And they drove a lot of activities associated with the space race of the 1960s, which I'm going to talk about now. This all began in 1961, May 25th of 1961 to be exact, when John Kennedy, a brand new president, elected in the fall of 1960, inaugurated in January of 1961, who is embarrassed by a couple of things that took place in his early administration vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The first was on the 12th of April of 1961, the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit. He made one flight around, he came back home. But it was a significant event, and Yuri Gagarin was one of these charismatic, handsome, thoughtful, very effective speaker, and he impressed the world with what he talked about in terms of what the Soviet Union was doing and how modern and forward-thinking it was. And the Americans took it on the chin when the Soviets were successful there. Less than a week after that flight, the American-backed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba failed, and Kennedy had a black eye there. Pretty bad black eye, certainly worse than the Gagarin thing. And at that point he said, in effect, we've got to change the subject. Politically, this is killing me and the Democrats. And we have to do something that is spectacular. He sends a memo to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, in which he said, what can we do in space that will have great impact, that will impress the rest of the world, and be able to beat the Russians at it? Those were the requirements. And Apollo was born out of that discussion. For about 6 weeks after that memo was written, Lyndon Johnson investigated this with NASA. What can you guys do? He went to Congress and talked to the members of Congress about what they would support, and they came back with this decision to go to the moon. Kennedy unveiled it in an afternoon speech on the 25th of May. And the key phrase, see if I can do the accent. I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. And he goes on to talk about why it's important. Oh, by the way, Buzz Aldrin told me that returning him safely to the earth was his favorite part of the speech. So, anyway, he gives this speech, and he talks about how it's going to cost a lot of money. That's a part of his written text. But he ad-libs a piece of it the same thing at the end of the speech that's not a part of the text. Initially, he says, it's going to cost a lot of money, but Congress is going to have to decide whether or not they want to do this. He returns to that same theme at the end of his speech in which he said, this is going to cost a lot of money. You guys have to decide that this is something you want to do. And it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of money year after year after year. And if you don't want to spend that money, you need to tell me now. Let's not go down this road. And when he gave the speech, he didn't get a rousing applause. You can watch it on YouTube if you want. The whole speech is there. And when he talks about going to the moon, there's some polite applause, but there's nothing, they don't jump out of their seats and start clapping. As he comes back and gets in the limo and heads back to the White House from the Capitol, he's riding with Ted Sorensen, who is his speechwriter. And Kennedy turns to him and says, I don't know if Congress is going to go for this. The reaction wasn't all that positive. Maybe we need to think up a plan B. And Sorensen talks about it in his memoir, and he says he sort of patted Kennedy's knee, and he says, don't worry about it. Lyndon's got it under control. Meaning Lyndon Johnson, who was a master of the Congress. He'd been a Senate Democratic leader for years. He knew how to do things. People talk about how certain members of Congress are really effective. Nobody was better than Johnson. Johnson could push you with his big belly around the room and corner you and try to persuade you. And if that didn't work, he could threaten you, which he would do. That funding that you want for something in your district, guess what? It's going away if you don't do what I want you to. That's the kind of thing that happened. And by the way, Sorensen was right. When the first budget was approved for NASA for the next year, they did it on a voice vote. They did not even divide the room and take account because it was overwhelmingly by acclamation. And Apollo was reflected in that particular budget. Those were the things that led us to that decision. And it was about a crisis that was engaged in at that point in time. It's very important that you remember that this is a moment in time. Just within a few days after the speech on the 25th of May, David Bell, who's the budget director for Kennedy, goes into the Oval Office and he says, have you seen what NASA's spending to go to the moon? They're going to break the bank. We really need to find a way out of this. And Kennedy says, well, is it really that bad? And he sort of lays out the numbers for him. He says, well, maybe I should try to do something. He meets Khrushchev in a summit. And Nikita Khrushchev was the Soviet premier at the time. His one and only meeting with him that took place the first part of June, just a couple of weeks after the speech. And Kennedy says, I talked about this going to the moon thing. Maybe we should do this together. What do you think? And Khrushchev says, that might be a good idea. Let's talk about it some more. The next day, after they finish their evening activities, they get back together the next day, and Kennedy raises it again. Well, what do you think? The hardliners had gotten to Khrushchev overnight. He said, no, you can't do that. If you do that, what you will show the Americans, if a joint program would enable them to understand our technological capabilities, and if they know that they can nuke us out of existence if they want to, and we can't do much about it. And so Khrushchev's response was, that's something to think about, but I think we've got some other things we need to work on first, like some sort of nuclear test ban treaty, maybe some strategic arms treaties, some things of this nature that need to come first. And they dropped it at that point. Now, by the way, Kennedy returned to this a couple of years later and proposed doing it in public to the United Nations in September of '63. Anyway, this sets on course the NASA efforts to go to the moon. And I've got a few things about this, and I've sort of already said this, so I'm going to skim this very quickly. Apollo was a strategic imperative for the United States, and it had everything to do with the Cold War and nothing to do with space exploration. It's truly important that you understand that they made this decision to do this based upon the geopolitical issues at hand at the time. It's not that we didn't further the objectives of learning about the cosmos, and we certainly had a great adventure going to the moon, but that was not the primary objective. And that's the most important thing to understand about this. And I would also suggest to you that by 1963, Kennedy's very worried about this. He is afraid that the Republicans are going to use the cost, and that's what it was always about, the cost of Apollo to beat him up in the 1964 re-election campaign. And he's talking about how can we cut some of the budget out of the NASA efforts here? Can we do some other things that might make this a little more palatable? Can we bring the Russians into it? As I said, he went to the UN and gave a speech about this and said that we should that we should turn this into a joint program with the Soviet Union. Wouldn't that have been an interesting development? Khrushchev heard that speech in the Kremlin. He called his son, Sergei Khrushchev, who's still alive, by the way, and is on the faculty at Brown University, who's a U.S. citizen, which I'm sure has got Nikita twirling in his graves. But he worked in the design bureau that was responsible for the bulk of the Soviet successes in space during that early period. He was an aerospace engineer. And so Nikita Khrushchev calls his son from the Korolev Design Bureau to come into the Kremlin and talk to him about it. And they go through this, what are the pros and cons? Well, a big pro would be that you could cut down the amount of money we're spending on this. The Americans are thinking the same thing by turning it into a joint program. But the other issue comes up. They'll see how weak we are. If we have a program in which we exchange our information, they know that we don't have near the capability they have. And we don't want to give them that knowledge. Kennedy is assassinated in November of 1963. Khrushchev is deposed not long thereafter, and that is the end of a cooperative discussion. It is a fascinating question to ask. What might have happened had Kennedy not been assassinated, had Khrushchev not been deposed? Could they have turned the moon program into a joint program instead of a race? What might have happened? I would suggest to you a couple of things that were almost a given. They could have turned off the clock. We don't have to get to the moon by the end of the decade. That clock always drove the budget. Because we've got to spend all this money, because we've got to get there by the end of the 1960s. So that's the first thing that would have happened. After Kennedy's assassination, this became sort of the gold watch that NASA pulled all the time whenever somebody wanted to cut its budget. Do you mean to tell me, Mr. or Ms. Member of Congress, that you want to end the dying wish of our slain president? And the response was, well, no, maybe not. And the vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who became president, protected Apollo. I mean, NASA's budget begins to collapse in 1965, but they always protected Apollo. So the objectives were pretty simple. Largely a response to the Soviet Union's activities in space, land an American on the moon by the end of the decade, return him safely to the Earth, Buzz Aldrin's requirement. Demonstrate American prowess, plant an American flag. That's the most important thing. We're demonstrating that we're doing this. And that has been a source of pride for a long time. There's a couple of great quotes that I didn't include here, but I will just say them to you. So some of you may remember the All in the Family series from the 1970s with Archie Bunker and as a bigot on national television. And there's one episode from 1971 in which he pulls out, and he's showing it to somebody, a mission patch from Apollo 14. And he says, this is what sets us apart, us Americans apart, from all them other losers. We can go to the moon, and they can't. And then, of course, Sam Kinison, the late great philosopher, poet, comedian, but mostly a philosopher poet, said, "You want to impress us? Bring back our flag." And that's still present in a whole lot of ways. So the basics of Apollo were simple. There was robotic precursors, the Ranger, Surveyor, and Lunar Orbiter spacecraft, robotic spacecraft that did things to understand more about the moon so we could actually land people. It was a $25.4 billion project over the course of a decade. And you multiply that by about 8 or 9 to get today's dollars, and I would suggest it's still a bargain. But not everybody thought so at the time, nor since. 61 to 72 is the program dates. First landing was Apollo 11 on the 20th of July of 1969. Last landing, Apollo 17 in December of 1972. There were 6 landings, 3 circumlunar flights, some orbital flights as well, and that was the program. This is what it cost us. So this is the percentage of the federal budget spent on NASA during this era. And I'm going to walk away from the microphone. Can everybody still hear me? Yes. Okay. So if you look at this bump over here, that big mountain, that's the plus up that took us to the moon. At its height, NASA's consuming about 4.5% of the federal budget. Today, it's consuming less than 0.4% of the federal budget. If NASA had that kind of money, they'd be on Mars. Because they really want to do it. And so do I. That's not a bad thing. But they're not going to get that kind of money. But what you can see is it peaks about 1965, and then the roller coaster heads down, and it stays below 1% right up to the present. A little bit higher, a little bit lower, but right now it's about 0.4%. But that's the investment that took us to the moon. And it was a significant investment.
The first thing Werner von Braun said when we landed on the moon, he said, let's get the funding to go to Mars.
Yeah, well, that wasn't going to happen. But here's another piece to this. A lot of people look back on Apollo, those of us who remember it, with sort of rose-colored glasses, in which we think that everybody loved it. Totally not true. So once again, I'm going to walk away from the mic. If you can hear me fine, if you can't, say something. I usually don't have a problem in a room this size. So if you ask the question, these are public opinion polls from the 1960s and into the 70s. If you ask the question, is Apollo worth the cost? The yes line is graphed with the blue. 35% in 62, goes up to about 45% in 65, back down below 50%. The only point it goes above 50% is 1969 at the time of the moon landing. And then it just falls off the table. That's the blue line. If you ask the question, are we spending too much money on space? That is the red line. And it's, yes, we're spending too much on space. And that's absent Apollo, it's just everything in space. So, are we spending too much? Yes, about 35%, down to about 30% in 64. It toggles back and forth. But about the point where the moon landings are successful, 68, 69, it starts up and gets above 50%. We're spending too much on this stuff. We have to cut back. And NASA's already starting to feel that because the budget's already going seriously down. But if you ask the question, do you approve of Apollo? That's the green line up top. Divorce it from the money. Do you like it? Do you think it's neat? Do you think the astronauts are cool? Whatever it is. And it's almost always above 60%. Yeah, we like it. The real story is we like it, we just don't want to pay for it. And that has been the case with space activities since that time too. That was the case with Apollo. Not everybody thought it was a great idea. We didn't do it because everybody thought it was a wonderful idea. We did it for geopolitical purposes. And that has been the critical factor with anything else big we want to do in space. What are the reasons for doing it? I'll get to that in a minute. So, Apollo, when we look back on it, does have some importance. So this is a Norman Rockwell painting. Couldn't you guess that? And here you can see the Apollo 11 astronauts gazing off into a distant future where things are better, I guess. And a whole bunch of people associated with NASA. You can pick in the middle right there, Wernher von Braun, a name that may be known to many of you, rocket engineer from Huntsville. German immigrant, built the V-2 in World War II, came over with a bunch of his Nazi cohorts. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say it that way. And built rockets for first the military and then NASA. A number of other people associated in the upper echelons of the NASA program and rank and file that you can see toward the bottom. These are real people. And they're all staring off in the distant future, and this is a great thing moving forward. So, but Apollo has this master story about it. And it's one in which the Americans are initially embarrassed by the Russians, by the Soviet Union, this totalitarian state with a diametrically opposed political and economic system that was our adversary in the Cold War. And we were shocked by Sputnik, and we were shocked by their early efforts in space, and we were shocked by Gagarin, and they had a number of other successes as well. We were constantly shocked early on. But it is also cast as the standard story of American progress. We're shocked and surprised, and then we respond, and we do what we've always done, and we succeed. So, at some level, this is a story of American exceptionalism, a term that we might question whether or not we should use, but nonetheless, it is one that helps to capture this particular mindset, I believe. And this story of American success in adversity as we move through this crises of the 50s and 60s into the success that we demonstrate with the moon landings in the 1960s and 70s. And oh, by the way, I'm not going to address, everybody here does accept we landed on the moon, right? Because if we don't, we may be here until I convince you. So you might as well just stipulate to it now. Anyway, but this is very much a story that comforts us as a nation and sort of makes us nostalgic for a time in which we think things might have been better. And anybody who's done any study of this era knows that it wasn't better. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was much worse. I'll leave that at that point. If we want to follow up on that in Q&A, we can. So I would suggest to you that there's sort of a pervasive power to Apollo, and it's captured in imagery as much as anything else. There's a lot of other things about it. The first image, and there's about a half a dozen or so iconic images that came out of Apollo. The first is Buzz Aldrin saluting the American flag from the Apollo 11 landing in 1969. Pretty significant picture. Everybody has seen this a zillion times, used in all kinds of ways. It was, the MTV in its early days replaced the flag with their logo and used it on the MTV. It's still basically the MTV Video Music Award statue. And that is an example of something that has a very important resonance. I mentioned to you earlier that one of the most important things that the people in charge wanted to do was plant a flag. And that is because of the larger context of European exploration, beginning with the expansion about 1500 of Europe around the world. Wherever they went, whoever the explorer was would reach land, they would plant their flag, raise their sword to heaven, and claim the territory for whatever sovereign they served. Notably, the Americans planted the flag and did not claim any territory. And that's not an insignificant and certainly a specific outcome that those who engineered the program were seeking to accomplish. We are different from the imperial nations that came before. Not that we're not imperial, mind you, but we're not imperial in that way. Second picture, the boot on the moon, the boot print on the moon, also from Apollo 11. Buzz Aldrin took this picture. By the way, Buzz Aldrin took almost all of these kind of pictures like this. Neil took all the others of individuals because he had the big camera. But this particular picture, the boot print on the moon suggests that eons from now, long after we are either planet hopping somewhere else or extinct on this planet, whatever creature visits the moon, since there is essentially no seismic activity there and nothing to disturb that boot print until somebody else lands there and walks on it, it'll be there centuries from now. Pretty significant development. Here once humans from Earth set foot. The launch of a Saturn V rocket. Anybody ever seen a space shuttle launch? A few of you. It's an impressive experience in that particular way. You're about 3.5 miles away from it. You were with the Saturn V launch as well at the Kennedy Space Center, and you see this bright, bright light in the sky off in the distance. If it's a nighttime launch, it's even more spectacular. But regardless, you see that, but you don't hear anything at first because light travels faster than sound.
7.5 million pounds of thrust.
At launch on the Apollo rocket, yes. And the experience is one that is almost transforming in the way in which you see this. First you start to see it, then it starts beating on your chest. The sound waves hit you. I never saw Saturn V launch. I've seen many shuttle launches, and that's an experience in itself. But can you imagine, as the gentleman said, 7.5 million pounds of thrust at launch, essentially a nuclear weapon under total control by the crew that was overseeing it. It's an impressive experience. It was impressive for everybody who experienced it whatsoever.
There was no nuclear payload on that.
There was later. There's a couple of images that are very significant in the context of sort of what we understand about this planet, and this is one of them. This is called Earthrise. It's an image taken in December of 1968 from the moon by the Apollo 8 crew. You see in the foreground the moon, gray and lifeless, and in the distance, a blue and white marble hanging in the blackness of space. It's symbolized in ways that we had not begun to understand yet, that everything we know, everything we love, everything we hate, is here on this planet. All the life that we know of in the universe exists on that particular planet. And when you look at it from afar, it's not all that impressive. It did signal for a lot of people that, we're on a little ship and there aren't any lifeboats. Maybe we better take better care of this planet. I would contend that that's still a lesson we need to learn. But it certainly did give cognizance to efforts underway at the time of the modern environmental movement that was starting to emerge in the 1960s. This one did as well. The whole Earth image from Apollo 17 in 1972. Here you can see the only good picture of the whole Earth. Usually there's part of it in shadow or something, but this is the whole Earth. And it symbolizes the same sort of thing. This became sort of a dominant image used in the environmental movement all through the 1970s and since. You can see very readily Antarctica down here, Horn of Africa up here, the Persian Gulf toward the top. For many, many years, NASA refused to use this picture for anything. Guess why? North America is not in it. United States is not there. You're absolutely right. They've learned better, but nonetheless, that's the way it has gone. The last picture is what I like to refer to as the Buzz Aldrin full frontal. In this particular image, which went around the world in the aftermath of the Apollo 11 flight, used in all kinds of settings, in all kinds of ways, even by Andy Warhol for some of his art. And in this particular case, Buzz was walking away from Neil Armstrong. And you sort of get this, you notice his left arm is kind of cocked. Well, he was walking away, and Neil said, "Hey, turn around." So he swung his arm and went this way, and he still had it up when they took his picture. you can see Neil reflected in the visor, right in the middle. But these images have had a dominant impact. And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of images, but these are the ones you see in all kinds of settings that are used in all kinds of ways. On another presentation, I have numerous ad campaigns and so forth that use these images for all kinds of purposes, and some of them are a little bit weird. But we're not going to talk about that. One other picture that I would suggest to you is just as important but not as famous is this one. Can you tell what it is? Obviously I say, so it's not all that hard. This is from Apollo 17. This is a panorama. You can see Jack Schmitt with the lunar rover over on the edge of a crater. Let me help you. This symbolizes, I think, as well as anything, why we never went back. We found nothing we wanted. A few geologists, there may be some in this room, liked it because of what we found from a scientific perspective, but we found nothing of worth, of value to us. If we had, and that has driven all terrestrial exploration, we have to find something we want or we don't go back. If we find something we want, then we go figure out a way to exploit that, in some cases take it away from other people, but nonetheless, that is the case. We found nothing on the moon that we wanted. Doesn't mean it's not there, it just means we didn't find it. And I would suggest to you, more than any other reason, this is the reason we haven't been back. And I think it's problematic we'll be going back anytime soon. Which leads me to the next thing. We did all of this between 69 and 72, and then we stopped doing it. There's been lots of efforts to try to do more. In 1969, NASA convened under the president's direction the Space Task Group to study what they were going to do post-Apollo, and they came up with a plan. Let's build a space shuttle. Let's build a space station. Let's build a moon base. Let's go to Mars. That's their number one agenda. Oh, you don't like that one? Okay, well, we're going to do shuttle, station, moon base, expedition to Mars, but not as quickly. Oh, you don't like that? Well, let's try Plan C. We're going to do all those things, but we're going to do it on a more restrained schedule after 2000. NASA was never willing to say, okay, we're not doing all of these things. We're just going to do maybe one. The White House made that decision for them, and that's where the space shuttle comes in. You could do the space shuttle and not do a space station and not do a moon base and not do Mars. But you can't do the others without doing the shuttle first. So they chose the shuttle. So they tried to get that passed in the early 1970s, and they failed utterly. They would only go for the shuttle. In 1989, the first Mr. Bush, president, stood on the steps of my museum and announced that we were going to go back to the moon and on to Mars. As soon as somebody began to crunch the numbers, they figured it was going to cost $1 trillion, and guess what? That didn't happen.
What about the Apollo-Soyuz test project?
Well, we'll talk about that later. That's not the same at all. That's just Apollo technology being used to do a thing with the Russians. In the aftermath of the Columbia accident in 2004, in 2003, 2004, the second Mr. Bush goes to NASA and announces, we're going to go back to the moon and on to Mars. How much is it going to cost? When that is briefed to members of Congress, one of them says, are you people insane? And got up and walked out. That's sort of where we are. You know, there's been moves since that time. Mr. Trump has said maybe we should go to the moon and build a base. Maybe we should go to Mars and build a base. Mr. Gingrich has said that too. And my response to that is like the Tom Cruise film, Show Me the Money. Nobody has shown us the money, and it's not going to happen until there's a willingness to do that. Do you want to plus up the budget for NASA to 4% total to be able to accomplish these things? Most people don't. There are some of us who would be fine with that. I can think of lots of ways in which we could spend less money on other things and more money on doing this. But everybody has those items as well. And we never thought it was a great idea. So this is a set of questions in which it is asked, should the government fund human trips to the moon? It goes back to 1961. The people in favor are in blue. The people who say, no, this is a bad idea, are in red. Look at the reds. They're mostly higher than the blues. The interesting development is right here in the middle between December of 96 and December of 97, in which you've got this overwhelming anomaly of people saying, yeah, let's do this. The people who did the polls suggest that that was a response to the film Apollo 13, which came out in 1995. That's the best thing that they could come up with, that pop culture had changed the public's opinion on this for a short period of time. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not, but that was their analysis. Okay. Here's the fundamental problem. Anybody ever read that particular cartoon? Someday I might travel to another planet, but I'm not sure why. That's the fundamental problem. So there's been all these efforts. Trump signaled support last December 2017, but nothing has come of it, and there's been no money attached to it. So nonetheless, nothing's happened yet. But what are the reasons for doing it? I would suggest to you that they were all geopolitical in the 1960s. That's what drove the decision, that sustained the decision throughout that particular time frame. But absent that, we never would have made a decision to do it. And maybe we would never have done it. Maybe we would have done it over a longer period of time and spent less money per year, and everybody would have been happy. But nobody knows. I would suggest we're sort of in this on the long haul. So I have mapped. This is a little outrageous, but nonetheless, this is my last slide. So this is English/American versus space settlement. So if you look at Columbus's first landing in the Americas in 1492, and the first British effort, now remember the Spanish come in very early and they're quite successful, and they're extracting all kinds of wealth from parts, not North America, but other parts of the Americas. The British tried to found a colony in 1585, 93 years after Columbus. It's unsuccessful. It's so-called lost colony of Roanoke. The first permanent English settlement in America, what became the United States, is Jamestown, 1607, 115 years after Columbus. And the first nation state, U.S. independence in North America, is 1776, 284 years after Columbus. So if you want to map a similar timeline on spaceflight, you get this. Yuri Gagarin, first human to fly in space, 1961. Americans, first landing on the moon, 8 years later, 1969. The first moon colony, using the timeline above, 115 years after Gagarin, would be 2076. Think we're going to see that? Some of you will be alive in 2076. Maybe. Who knows? And the first off-world republic, maybe. I had to use a star. I didn't know what to use, so I used star. First off-world republic, 2245, 284 years after Gagarin. If you want to think of this in the context of sort of American exploration in North America and the foundation of the United States, we're in this for the long haul, folks. And maybe that's the way we should think about it. But I'm not sure. I will quit with that. We went to the moon. I will state that categorically. We had a great time doing it. We learned some interesting things. Some science that came out of that was pretty useful. But that's not why we went. It rode piggyback on a larger program that was about impressing the rest of the world, especially the Soviet Union. And I guess for those who would like to go into space and do a lot of exploration, the question I would ask is, what is the trigger mechanism that would open the treasury, either governmental treasury or private sector treasury, I don't care which, that would spark the kind of investment we need to make to return to the moon.
Our very humanity.
There's that ethereal comment. It's human destiny. All right, with that, I will quit. Thank you all very much. Do we have time for questions?
So we have about 25 minutes or so for questions, and we are taping this, but we're not going to walk around with a mic, so please be very loud in your questions. Yes?
Yeah, back to your comment about those being pretty bad times back in '69. I was in college then, and it was horrible. I mean, it
yeah.
was the Vietnam issue, the race riots, the whole thing. I was fortunate enough to attend 2 of the Apollo launches. I think it was 12 and 13.
Okay.
And my perspective in that, I have never seen people come together like that.
Yeah.
You could drive up and down that beach for miles, and I don't care what political party you were from,
Yeah.
what your race was, people were excited. I mean,
Yeah.
there were flags everywhere.
No question about
Yeah,
that.
it was amazing.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things, and I didn't talk about that in this context, but everybody sort of comes together at these big events and participates in them vicariously in the case of going to a launch or watching it on television. But, and they're excited by it at that point in time, and then they go back to their daily lives. That happened everywhere. And there are story after story after story of people who sort of pause about that thing and take note of it and are excited by it, at least momentarily. And this intersects, by the way, with the Civil Rights Crusade as well. So Ralph Abernathy in 1969 was running the Poor People's Campaign, and he took wagons from the Deep South, stopped at Kennedy Space Center in 1969 at the time of the launch for a protest. And to the credit of the NASA administrator at the time, Tom Paine, not the same guy who wrote Common Sense, but nonetheless, he went out to meet with them. And they talked back and forth. And Paine wrote a memorandum about this, about the give and take that they had at the time. And Abernathy told him, what a misplaced use of funds. We have people who cannot feed their families. Why are we spending money on this? And by the way, Abernathy was absolutely right. Is that a proper allocation of funds? And that's a political question. There's no question about that. And he was trying to make a case. And Paine said the right things. He said, you know, if I could solve that problem by not pushing the button to send these astronauts to the moon, I would, but that's not going to solve it. And then he invited the people who were on the Poor People's Campaign to come to the launch as his guest, and they did. And he asked them to pray for the astronauts and their safety, and Abernathy did that too. So at some level, it's an example of this intersection of this, unrest that's taking place in the latter part of the 1960s and its relations to spaceflight, and it does demonstrate the coming together at some level of those activities. So you're absolutely right about the larger context.
People fail to see the byproduct
Excuse me,
of
can
space
you
research.
please
Like
wait
everything
and
from
let
auto
other people
ignition
have a
systems
turn?
to your cell phones to everything that a lot of our technology now came out of space research.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
but
sure, I
you
can use
said
the
a
mic.
lot.
I'm adding to the,
Okay, but
I'm
we'd like to
adding
let
to
other
this, ma'am.
people have a chance to ask questions.
Okay, somebody else. Yeah.
You were saying in the picture of the Apollo 17 panorama that there were no chances of harvesting resources on the moon. However, I read an article on Scientific American that Leonard David interviewed Jack Smith.
Right.
Also
About helium-3.
about
Yeah.
helium-3
Right.
elements that could be resource. So right now, what are your views about that?
Okay. All right, so helium-3 is something that does occur on the moon, does not naturally occur here on Earth. In theory, it can be mined. In theory, it can be refined. In theory, it can be used to power plants that will create energy. The operative phrase here is in theory. We've never done anything with it outside of a very small laboratory. Doesn't mean we can't, but it's not a certainty that it's there that we can do anything with it at this point in time. And Jack Schmidt may be absolutely right. It's there in abundance, and it would be easy to mine and refine and use. Or he may be wrong about each of those. It may not be there in abundance. It may not be there. It may not be easy to mine. It may not be easy to refine and to use. We don't know the answer to those questions. Until we do, I don't think there's going to be a gold rush associated with that particular resource. But that's not to say we shouldn't do more with it. But I don't know that I would get excited at this point in time about its use.
Not to mention water and bauxite.
Yeah. In the back.
So, two-part question. The first one is that looks like China is trying to restart this space race thing,
Mm-hmm.
going back to the moon. So, do you think that would spur us joining along in this race? And the second part is to his question about resources there. I've read that there actually is stored water/oxygen there.
Yeah.
So would it make sense if for a moon base to be built there so that you can use that to spur the exploration?
Yeah, okay. Good questions. Let me try to tackle them because they're two different things. So would China spark another moon race is sort of the gist of the first question. They have announced that they would like to do things on the moon. They did put a rover there not very long ago on the backside of the moon, and it's collecting data and sending images back. So that's a step in that particular direction. Right now, it's hard to see how China would spark us to respond in the way that we responded to the Soviet Union. For one thing, we don't fear China in the same way at all. We feared the Russians. Now, maybe we should fear China. That's not the issue, but we don't at this particular point in time. Mostly we want to trade with them and or run tariffs on them or whatever the latest thing is. But we have not responded. Even though the Chinese have had some notable successes, they launched their first human into orbit in 2004, I believe. They've had some success with an orbital workshop and a crew aboard that. So clearly they have some capabilities, and they're demonstrating those capabilities. Maybe we'll get excited down the road, but thus far it's been a collective ho-hum. The second is about the possibility of ice on the lunar poles. And there is some scientists who say that it's there, and there, by the way, there are other scientists who say it's not there. It has not been proven sufficiently to satisfy the lunar science community one way or another yet. Now, if there is ice there, it would have been, and what they're saying is that it's deep in a crater on the northern polar region and on the southern polar region, where the sun never comes in. It's completely dark all the time. Well, I mean, there may be some ambient light, but there's no direct sunlight on that particular base, and it's several miles deep in this crater. So if it's there, and that's still an open question, I had a good friend who was a lunar scientist who absolutely said it was there, wrote books about it, did all this other kind of stuff. I have another good friend who's a lunar scientist at the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, who does radar, ground-penetrating radar stuff, and he says it's absolutely not there. It's false reading. Who's right? I don't know. And they don't know either because they're arguing about this. But once again, if it is there, it does change the nature of things, because if we can get down to where it is located, and it is sort of deep in a crater, and we can dig some of that out, we can melt it into water, we can separate it into oxygen and hydrogen, and that changes the nature of resources on the moon, because we can do things with oxygen and water, or oxygen and hydrogen too. So maybe that'll happen. But right now, we still have to determine. It's a little bit like some of the helium-3 things. There's some possibilities, and maybe we'll figure out ways to actually ascertain if it's really there and do something with it, but we're not there yet. And I would argue for a lot more robotic probes to help us learn the answers to that question. Anybody? Yeah, sure.
this happened all in a hurry in the 60s, and there was a lot of scientific development, technological development that happened. A lot of it could not necessarily have been predicted. Do you have any kind of, in your own mind, what's your thoughts about the significance of what happened in the process for for us today, in terms of how much further ahead we are than we
Yeah.
have we not done it? I mean, has it been overblown? Or?
Yeah, you're sort of asking, not in exactly the same way I hear NASA talk about it, but about spin-offs. And NASA publishes a periodical every year and tracks what they refer to as NASA spin-offs. It's technology, commercial products usually, that have some of their history in research done under NASA contract or grant for spaceflight purposes. And those things are real. They do exist. No question about that. Are they as great and as significant as NASA would like to have you believe? I question that.
There are thousands.
Okay. There are thousands of things that NASA says exist. The question is, are they legitimate? One of the things that I did at NASA,
Your cell phone, that came out of that.
actually it didn't, and that's another issue.
It was a technological progression.
Sir, we can talk about this offline. The big issue is, how can you trace something from NASA's efforts through some sort of corporate activity to create some sort of product that is then marketed to somebody else? It's hard to do. It's a very difficult process. And I wish it were simpler, but it's not. Well, I was going to tell a story, and I will do that, that is basically, and it's sort of an indirect story, but I think it's real. So in the 1960s, the Draper Lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology was contracted with by NASA to build a guidance computer for Apollo, which they did. They assembled the best minds that they could come up with in the 1960s, about 500 people, to work on this. And they built it. It had to have a certain power and a capability that had never been done before in the size and a weight that would be appropriate for the spacecraft. They did their job. At the end of the contract, the program is completed, and the contract ends. And these engineers, most of whom are electrical engineers, disperse everywhere. And they go to universities, think tanks, industry, and so on and so forth. They go everywhere. And in the process of that, they took the knowledge that they gained from the work they had done under NASA contract and their Rolodex, their contact list, for those of you who are a little younger and don't know about physical Rolodexes. But their contact list of all the people they'd worked with and had relations with in terms of doing this particular work. They went everywhere. And they seeded the microelectronics industry. And I would contend, it's hard to prove, but I would contend that that was a push in that particular arena. In the 1970s was where the takeoff in microelectronics really begins to emerge. And so I think you can make cases like that, but it's sort of indirect and not quite the same thing as what I hear in other settings. So I wish I could track more stories and really make a good case on these things, but it's hard to do, and it requires a lot of work. Yes?
What would be what's your take on how the, let's say, mixed history of the space shuttle program and its eventual decommissioning without any kind of follow-up, what that has done to the state of space exploration in America and the larger world?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the canceling of the space shuttle, that came in the aftermath of the loss of Columbia in 2003. President Bush, the second Mr. Bush, announced that they were going to finish the work building the International Space Station. There were still some more modules to take up. And then at the completion of that, they were going to terminate that particular program, which is what they did. They had contingencies in place, and they had entered into agreements with the Russians to launch American astronauts on Russian Soyuz capsules, which we've been doing since 2011 when the last shuttle flew. There are those of us, and I'm in this category, are looking forward to seeing new vehicles come online that are flown by, from Cape Canaveral or from Wallops Island or someplace like that, that are American-owned and operated. We are hopeful that we're going to see that within the next year to 2 years, but it was sort of depressing, to be perfectly honest, that the shuttle was canceled without an immediate successor sort of in line. But it looks like we're going to get past that. I think we are, and we'll go from there. Yes?
When my grandson and I visited Kennedy, and they talked about a company named SpaceX.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Sure.
how that kind of dovetails in with what NASA?
Yeah. So SpaceX was created in the first part of the 21st century by Elon Musk, and some of you know that name, I'm sure. He's become notorious in certain circles for smoking pot online and things of that nature. But he's also a genuine, honest-to-goodness entrepreneurial genius in a lot of ways. And he created SpaceX with the intention of building a launch vehicle that would be able to take things into Earth orbit. And that's what he's been doing. Now, he's had help from NASA along the way to develop that rocket, both in terms of technology that's been transferred to the company, but also direct payments for some percentage of what the work is, not the full amount, but some percentage of it. They began launching payloads, resupply trips to the International Space Station, I want to say 2009, maybe 10, and they hope to fly the first American astronaut to the space station later 2019 or into 2020. We'll see if it's successful, but that's what they intend to do. That's what they want to do. Now, they're not the only company doing this. Orbital ATK, which is another company that's also been doing it, and their Antares rocket is on the same trajectory to send astronauts as well. So it may turn out that we will have multiple ways of putting astronauts into orbit within the next couple of years. And that would be great. I think that would be wonderful. Anyway, yes?
So it was interesting too, I didn't know that Kennedy reached out to Khrushchev for a joint operation, and somehow it seems to contradict then this geopolitical explanation in the sense that, if the interest was to impress the world, and it was sort of, in this bipolar world,
Yeah.
how is it then, like, why would Kennedy be interested in doing this joint operation, other than, budget-wise and
Yeah, Kennedy's concerns were very much built around how this would come back to beat him up in the re-election bid in 1964. That's what he was concerned about. And of course, then he died in November of 1963, so there was no re-election for him to worry about. But the reality is, others did not necessarily share his same concerns with this geopolitical rivalry that was taking place. And after his death, there was no effort to try to do anything in relationship with the Russians in the 60s. Anybody else? How about over here? Yeah, sir, yeah.
So, given all of that and kind of what you talked about with SpaceX too, what do you see as of the 5 things that you listed as becoming more of a driver, since it seems like we have collaborations with the Russians where they're flying cosmonauts and astronauts on the same vehicle to the International Space Station as well as the International Space Station needing collaboration. Do you see that more as a mixing pot, and where do you see the trends in terms of where we're moving towards as nations putting funding down and money to back this stuff for the future of space exploration?
Yeah, I do think that, everybody hear that? I do think that one of the things that we're going to see is more international collaboration. I think that's a way to go. And if there's going to be a return to the moon, and certainly in the context of some sort of lunar base, we could totally do a lunar base if we chose to do so. It would be expensive, but we could do it. I think it would look a lot like Antarctica. We would cycle people in and out on a regular basis, and scientists would be down there doing, or up there in this case, doing things that would be useful in that context. But I do think that would be an international consortium that would probably do those activities. And that makes a lot of sense. There's lots of nations that have capabilities. And I sort of view capabilities as sort of a pyramid. There's there's a lot of countries sort of at the base of the pyramid who have the capability, who have scientists who are engaged in science pursuits. And they may be part of a team of scientists, an international team that's engaged in some mission somewhere. The next level would be, can they build their own spacecraft themselves? Rather than just having a scientist who's on a mission team that's NASA's operating, can you build your own spacecraft and fly it? The third level would be, can you launch your own spacecraft? Do you have your own rockets to do that? Not everybody does. But they can find launchers elsewhere. The fourth level is there a human program? And what's the relationship of that? And then last, the top is there a program to go to another location like the moon or Mars? Nobody's doing that right now. But there's clearly two nations that are engaged in Earth orbital activities with their own rockets and spacecraft, the Russians and the Chinese, and a whole other bunch of nations that are doing that in consortium with those groups. And that's sort of the pyramid from my perspective, and that sort of encapsulates most of these activities. And I think as you move up the scale, there's more and more capabilities in each of these nation states. Yeah.
Just curious, it's been decades since Apollo 17. You talked about if we ever go back to the moon. Is it really just as simple as, oh, we just flip a switch and that's it, we can go back?
No.
Wouldn't there be a lot of new
Yeah.
things to totally restart all over again?
Yeah. Yeah, we'd have to rebuild the technologies that we would need to do it. And some people have said, well, why don't we just go get they usually say blueprints. And any engineer in the audience knows that's not it. For the Saturn V and the Apollo, no, you can't really do it that way. But and you wouldn't want to anyway. Technology's changed so much. The kinds of circuits that they used. They had 1960s technology, in some cases 50s technology on that spacecraft, and we want to build it at least with 2000s technology. So there would be a lot of work to make it happen. But it's not like we haven't done it before, so we understand sort of the nature of the environment and what has to be accomplished. And we could do it less expensively. That's possible too. Anybody else? Or have we, okay, up in the back.
First of all, when Apollo 15 was heading to the moon, I was born, so I have a little bit of affinity to that program.
Fair enough.
Thank you for being here. You had mentioned earlier, very, very briefly, that you were going to come back to Apollo-Soyuz.
Yeah, okay, let's do that.
The importance or lack thereof in cooperation with the U.S. and Soviet Union for the geopolitical nature of things from Apollo-Soyuz and later on with Shuttle Mir and how that translates
Yeah.
to the ISS.
Yeah, okay. So let's go back to Apollo-Soyuz. So in 1975, the Americans and the Russians fly a joint orbital flight, and they dock with the two spacecraft in orbit. Now, that was a big deal at the time. Unfortunately, it was a one-off. The effort was really the result of a détente by the Nixon administration trying to walk back the Cold War crises that had been taking place between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and to do something that would demonstrate that we have more in common than we don't. And so the proposal to do this joint mission, the Russians bought into, the Americans bought into, and the Americans used some Apollo hardware that had already been built, so it was in place. And it wasn't that hard to do. The one thing they had to build was a docking collar that both of the spacecraft could use. So they had to build some common piece there. But it had the added advantage of it did not allow the Russians to understand the American Apollo technology, and the Russians guarded their Soyuz technology as well, because they didn't interface at that level. It's just this docking thing is the only thing they had to meet. So they did it. It was cool. It was a diplomatic exercise more than anything else. It's too bad it didn't turn into something beyond that. Now, you mentioned the Shuttle Mir program. That's the result of the post-Cold War era. There's a whole variety of things that were happening along those lines, bringing the Russians into the American Space Station program. I say American, but it's an international consortium with Europeans and Canadians and Japanese and a variety of other countries. And bring the Russians into that, who had capabilities, and we wanted to use those. And we also didn't want their very capable engineers, who were bankrupt personally and the country itself was bankrupt, going somewhere else to do things we might not like. They had a lot of capabilities, so they build ballistic missiles for some bad guy out there that we might not like. We don't want them to do that. So, so let's employ them to work on our program, which is what we did. And a preliminary piece of that was to do these joint missions with Russian cosmonauts flying on the American shuttle, American astronauts flying on the Soyuz, and both of them going to the Mir space station, which was the last Russian space station. It deorbited, I think, 2001. But, and that was an interesting experience because it provided our astronauts with long-duration microgravity environments that they hadn't had up to that time, except during Skylab in the early 70s. Is that enough? Okay. Okay, thanks. Anybody? Yes, sir.
So circling back to the China point for a bit, how well do your 5 rationales map onto that program? Because it would seem like national prestige would again be...
It's totally significant. So yeah, it maps there too. I mean, you know, the Chinese have very specific things. They want to be viewed as a world leader. There's no question about that. In all kinds of settings, they want this. And this helps them attain that. It also does a couple of other really important things. I mean, if they can do useful scientific activities like the rover that they've got on the backside of the moon right now, that puts them on the map in that context. And they've not really played that much there previously. So that's important for them. And clearly the scientists in China are just like scientists anywhere else. They want to discover stuff. And that's a good thing. There's also all this spillover. When you develop these technologies, they have a variety of uses. They have military uses, so if you're building rockets to send taikonauts into Earth orbit, you're also using them, and you can use them usually before you actually send taikonauts, for military purposes, ballistic missiles and so forth, and they're doing that. And you're developing technologies that'll be useful, and you can use that technology to push other types of technologies in the country. So if you learn how to build a sophisticated electronics thing that goes into some satellite of your choice, does it also have application in some sort of earthbound activity? Maybe it does, or at least components of it might. And that's important too. Yeah?
We got to stop it there.
Oh, all right.
I've got to grab Mr. Launius to take him out to dinner with the students.
Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it.